Oak Creek Memorial sits on the edge of Norfolk like a ship anchored in concrete, its windows dark except for the fluorescent bleeding through the cardiac ward on the 3rd floor. 3 in the morning. The hour when hospitals stop pretending to be healing places and become what they actually are, places where people dissolve into their bodies and nothing else matters. Brooke Sullivan moves through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that comes from practice. Not from shyness. From intention. She knows how to be in a room without occupying it, how to perform tasks with such quiet competence that people stop seeing her entirely. Her scrubs are navy blue, creased at the seams, her badge clipped at precisely 45 degrees. The other nurses nod at her the way you nod at equipment, acknowledgement without connection. She doesn't take breaks in the common areas anymore. Hasn't for 6 months. She passes the break room on her way to the supply closet and hears the conversation stop. 3 voices, mid-laugh, cut clean. She doesn't pause. Doesn't look. Just keeps moving, her left leg favoring slightly on the turn, an old injury that never quite finished healing, and when she reaches for the crash cart in the medication bay, her sleeve rides up 2 inches. The scar tissue visible then is geometric and deliberate, the kind of pattern that comes from fragmentation rather than accident. Shrapnel. The other nurses have learned not to ask. In room 304, she pulls the privacy curtain back just enough to check the monitor. The patient hasn't arrived yet, but the room is already waiting. The bed is made with hospital corners so sharp they could cut. The equipment is positioned in a configuration most cardiac nurses would recognize but few would understand the reasoning behind. She's placed the defibrillator pads within arm's reach not for standard protocol, but for emergency response time measured in seconds rather than the 3 or for most facilities accept. She knows what happens when those seconds matter. She's lived those seconds. The charge nurse, Patricia, hands her the assignment sheet at 0247. Her voice is professional, neutral, the tone she uses with everyone but with an edge that suggests she's aware of the weight she's placing in Brooke's hands. Room 304. Admiral Raymond Hayes. Cardiac monitoring protocol, continuous. He'll be here within the hour. High-profile patient. Navy liaison will be present. Keep documentation meticulous. Brooke takes the sheet without comment. She reads it. Her hand doesn't shake. Not even a tremor. But her fingers move to her chest, under the fabric of her scrubs, to the single dog tag hanging there on a chain that broke 6 years ago. The chain is still broken. She's never replaced it. The dog tag is ice against her skin. Marja. That single word, if anyone knew how to read it, would explain everything about why she moves with tactical precision, why she sweeps rooms in systematic quadrants, why her hands move with the fluid certainty of someone who has done this work under conditions that would break most people into pieces. Marja. The operation that never officially existed. The team that was officially dissolved. The discharge that was officially dishonorable, filed under circumstances that were officially sealed, which meant officially, Major Brooke Sullivan had never been anything at all. She touches the dog tag one more time, then releases it. Lets it settle back against her ribs where it belongs, where no one can see it, where it can burn silently against her skin like a secret that never dies. At 0251, she finishes preparing the room. Everything in place. Everything ready. She checks the monitor one final time, the leads are positioned perfectly, the connections are secure, the waveform display is optimized for the kind of cardiac events that don't announce themselves. Just appear. One moment a steady baseline, the next moment everything gone. The hospital is moving now. She can feel it. The way a living thing shifts when something significant is about to arrive. She recognizes the rhythm of it, the slight increase in foot traffic, the way the charge nurse has positioned herself at the desk where she can monitor arrivals, the way the resident on call has appeared and is standing closer to the elevator than usual. They don't know why they're doing it. They've just been told, Admiral. Navy. High profile. The body responds to hierarchy even when the mind hasn't consciously registered it. Brooke returns to the medication bay to verify stock on the emergency supplies. Epinephrine. Amiodarone. Atropine. The medications that move between life and whatever comes after. She counts them the way a soldier counts ammunition. Not because she's paranoid. Because she's experienced. She's held people together with her hands when the pharmacy was 200 kilometers away and the only medicine available was whatever was in the trauma bag. The body remembers what the mind refuses to acknowledge. The elevator doors open at 0314. Dr. Marcus Caldwell steps out before anyone else, which tells Brooke everything she needs to know about the order of importance in this facility. Not the patient's family. Not the admitting physician. The cardiology department head, the one whose name appears on research papers funded by naval contracts, whose voice carries weight in hospital board meetings, whose connections run to places where decisions are made about careers and reputations. He's tall in the way that suggests he's never had to make himself smaller to fit anywhere. His white coat is pristine. His shoes are polished to a shine that reflects the fluorescent lights. Everything about him says a man who has never been questioned. He's followed by two residents, a nurse from admitting, and behind them, the patient. An older man in a wheelchair, navy uniform still immaculate despite the exhaustion visible in his jaw. Admiral Raymond Hayes. The name means nothing to Brooke. The uniform means something. The way the Admiral's hand touches his chest as they wheel him past the nurse's station means something more. Caldwell moves through the unit like he owns it. Maybe he does, in the ways that matter. His eyes scan the room, assess the setup, and when they find Brooke standing at the medication bay, something in his expression shifts. Not warmth. Recognition, maybe, but not the kind that leads to connection. The kind that leads to dismissal. Sullivan. He doesn't use her first name. Doesn't need to. The Admiral will be in 304. Standard monitoring protocol. I'll be directing the care plan personally. Notify me immediately if there's any deviation from normal sinus rhythm. And Sullivan, he pauses, and the pause is deliberate, weighted. Let's make sure we maintain appropriate scope of practice, shall we? This patient requires a certain level of expertise. The words land exactly where they're meant to land. Brooke stands at the medication bay with her hands perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She's heard every variation of this for 6 months now. Every iteration of the same message, you are not enough. You will never be enough. The fact that he doesn't know who she is, doesn't know what her hands have done, doesn't know the operations her silence has protected, that's not her problem to solve. Understood, doctor. 2 words. That's all she gives him. The deferential nurse. The one who knows her place. The one who will be invisible in the room, present but unremarkable, exactly the way she's learned to be. Caldwell nods, satisfied. He walks toward room 304, the residents trailing behind him, and Brooke returns to the crash cart. She checks the defibrillator pads one more time. They're already positioned for rapid application. They've always been positioned for rapid application. She didn't learn this from nursing school. She learned this in a place where time moved differently and seconds were measured in how many people you could keep breathing before the evacuation helicopters arrived. Patricia appears beside her, her voice low enough that no one else can hear. He's going to be difficult. Brooke doesn't look up from the cart. She's checking the 4 setup, the gauges, the flow rates. Everything precise. Everything purposeful. They always are. The break room will empty when she sits down later, if she sits down. The other nurses will find reasons to be elsewhere. She'll sit alone with her coffee growing cold, the cup's heat dissipating into the silence, and she'll touch the dog tag through her scrubs and remember that she's supposed to be invisible. That Major Brooke Sullivan doesn't exist anymore, never existed officially, was buried so deep under layers of classification and dishonorable discharge and sealed records that the woman breathing in this hospital, moving through these halls, is only ever going to be a nurse. Just a nurse. Limited education. Limited scope of practice. Limited everything. But that wasn't the problem. The dog tag burned against her ribs as she finalized the room setup, as Caldwell's voice drifted from the Admiral's doorway. as the hospital settled into its 3 in the morning rhythm and the monitor in room 304 began its steady, patient electronic hum. The rhythm that said everything was normal. The rhythm that would change the moment something went wrong, and in Brooke's experience, something always went wrong. The morning rounds began at 0630, and Dr. Caldwell arrived with the Admiral's family trailing behind him like an entourage summoned to witness his expertise. The son, a Marine Corps colonel with shoulders broad enough to block the doorway, stood with his mother, both of them studying the monitors with the intensity of people trying to decode a language they'd never learned. Brooke was adjusting the cardiac monitor settings when Caldwell entered, his white coat moving like a sail catching wind that only he could feel. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, not a greeting but a summons. "Explain your assessment of the patient's rhythm." She turned from the monitor, her hand steady, her voice measured with the precision of someone who'd given sit reps under fire. "The sinus rhythm is holding at 72 beats per minute. I'm seeing some mild ST segment changes, nothing acute yet, but I've documented the subtle T-wave flattening that appeared on the 0412 lead. The left ventricular function appears stable, but I'm monitoring for any progression." Caldwell held up his hand like a traffic cop stopping traffic that was moving too fast in his direction. "That's not what I asked. Perhaps someone with your limited education shouldn't be assigned to such a high-profile case. The Admiral deserves more than—" He paused, his eyes moving from her face to her scrubs to her shoes in a way that made it clear he was measuring her against some standard she would never meet, adequate. The Admiral's wife shifted her weight. The Colonel's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin like something trapped. Brooke took one measured breath, the kind of breath that came from learning to control your nervous system under mortar fire, from understanding that your body was an instrument and panic was just noise you could choose not to hear. A single tear escaped, sliding down her cheek with the inevitability of gravity. She wiped it without breaking her gaze, her eyes locked on Caldwell's with a calmness that made the room go very still. "I understand your concern, Doctor," she said, each word placed like a brick, like something permanent. "I'll continue providing the standard of care every patient deserves." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that takes up space. Caldwell's face darkened slightly, a flush creeping up his neck like he'd just realized that his attempt to break her had registered as something else entirely: composure. Authority. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He turned away without responding and began discussing the Admiral's medication regimen with one of the residents, his voice louder than necessary, as if volume could reclaim the space she'd just occupied. The Admiral's wife touched her husband's arm. The Colonel's eyes remained on Brooke for 2 more seconds, not with sympathy, but with something that looked like recognition, and then he followed his mother out of the room. Brooke finished checking the monitor leads and made careful notes on the chart. Her handwriting didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. But later, when she was alone in the supply closet retrieving extra EKG paper, she pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelving and allowed herself 15 seconds, 15, of something that wasn't crying but wasn't not crying either. Then she straightened her scrubs and returned to work. The break room was a study in subtle cruelty. Brooke pushed through the door at 0745, her coffee growing cold in a paper cup with her name written in blue marker, her own name, as if someone had to label everything to remember it belonged. 4 nurses sat at the table, Martinez from day shift, 2 residents, and the charge nurse who usually smiled at her. She watched, with the detached observation of someone who'd catalogued human behavior in conflict zones, as they found their excuses. Martinez checked her phone. "Oh, I need to." She stood, not finishing the sentence. One of the residents suddenly remembered a lab result that couldn't wait. The other was already gathering her things. The charge nurse lingered for exactly 3 seconds longer than the others, her mouth opening as if she might say something, then closing, then opening again. Finally, she just shook her head, a small, sad gesture, and left. Brooke sat down at the table. She didn't drink the coffee. She stared at it for 8 minutes while the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead, a sound like insects trapped in glass. The coffee grew cold. The cup sat empty of everything except her own name. By 1100, the formal write-up was posted on the unit board in the hallway, a laminated sheet that everyone would see, Everyone would read, everyone would remember. Caldwell had cited her for overstepping scope of practice, referencing the medication error she'd caught during the 0400 rounds. She'd noticed that the day shift nurse, one of Caldwell's preferred staff, had been about to administer a dose of metoprolol that would have dropped the Admiral's blood pressure into dangerous territory. Brooke had caught it, had mentioned it quietly, professionally, to the charge nurse, who'd corrected it before the dose went in. No harm. Patient safe. The standard work of nursing. Caldwell had written it up as her interference with physician-directed care and inability to understand professional hierarchy. She read it while standing in the hallway with 3 residents nearby, close enough to hear Caldwell's voice carrying from the conference room, nurses who don't understand their limitations, especially ones with certain military backgrounds. All that barracks mentality doesn't translate to civilian medicine. Barracks Brooke over there thinks she's still running combat operations. You have to set firm boundaries with that type or they'll take over your entire unit. The residents looked at their feet. One of them looked at Brooke. She was reading the write-up with steady hands, her face showing nothing, her eyes moving across the words with the efficiency of someone extracting information from a document that meant nothing because it could mean nothing if she decided it meant nothing. I'm going on break, she said to no one in particular, her voice so dry it barely qualified as sound. Before I solve any more problems that weren't supposed to be my responsibility. She walked past the conference room without looking at Caldwell, who was mid-sentence, his hand gesturing at something invisible, his voice shaped like contempt. The phone call came that afternoon, quiet, professional, from an administrator at the hospital board office. Caldwell had submitted a formal concern about her pattern of instability and scope creep. He was requesting a formal review. He had documented multiple instances of her overstepping her role. The administrator, a woman named Ms. Chen who sounded tired, said this was routine, nothing to worry about, just protocol, but Brooke could hear the space between the words where sympathy lived and couldn't quite break through. That evening, Caldwell made another phone call, this one from his office with the door half open. Brooke passed by while delivering evening medications and heard fragments, building a paper trail, documented everything, instability pattern, board members need to see this before it becomes a liability issue. His voice had the satisfied tone of someone laying bricks, building something that would take time but would be absolutely solid when finished. She continued down the hallway with the medication cart. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the single tag on the broken chain, the only evidence that Major Brooke Sullivan had ever existed, felt like it was burning through her skin. The Admiral spent the afternoon studying his monitors and his phone, refusing to make eye contact when she adjusted his leads. She recognized him now with absolute clarity. Admiral Raymond Hayes. The man who had sat across a folding table in a classified briefing room at 0800 on October 17 and testified under oath that Major Brooke Sullivan had disobeyed direct orders during the Marger operation, that she had compromised the mission, that her judgment could not be trusted. The man who had signed the dishonorable discharge papers. The man who had helped bury her. And now she was taking his vital signs. Now she was monitoring the electrical activity of his heart. Now she was the one keeping him alive while he lay there and pretended she was invisible. The shift ended at 2000. Brooke clocked out and drove home through Norfolk rain that felt like a judgment. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own thinking, and that was the last thing you wanted to do. She hung her scrubs to dry and stared at the dog tag in her palm. Silver, worn smooth by 18 years of contact with skin. A name stamped into the metal of Martinez, Louis J. The medic she'd held together in Marger, held literally together with her hands while his blood soaked through her uniform jacket and his eyes asked her a question she couldn't answer. She was packing leftovers into containers when the hospital called at 2200. A shift change emergency. Could she come in early? Someone had called out. They needed coverage on the cardiac floor. Yes, she said, and the word felt like a decision being made by something deeper than her mind. She touched the dog tag before she left the apartment. The metal was cold. She hung it around her neck, let it settle against her chest above her heart, and whispered a name into the empty room, Martinez. Then she drove back to Oak Creek Memorial, back to the fluorescent lights and the monitoring equipment and the Admiral sleeping in his bed, unaware that the invisible nurse he'd testified against was about to walk back into his life. The Admiral's cardiac rhythm had changed. Brooke noticed it at 22:47, when she was supposed to be invisible, moving through the cardiac unit during her final rounds before the day shift took over. The telemetry monitor displayed a rhythm she'd seen before, not in a textbook, but in a forward operating base 23 miles north of Marja, where a trauma surgeon's hands had trembled and a junior medic had known better than to wait for permission. T-wave inversion in leads 2, 3, and AVF. Subtle. The kind of change that separates a competent cardiologist from one who built his reputation on Navy contracts and board connections rather than clinical precision. She stood at the monitor station for exactly 4 seconds. Memorized the pattern. Documented the time, 2,247 hours. Then she moved, as she always moved, like someone who'd learned to exist in the space between being noticed and being invisible. She printed the rhythm strip and placed it in Admiral Hayes's chart with a written note, T-wave changes noted 2247. Recommend 12 lead EKG and comparison to baseline. Possible progression of ischemia. The day shift wouldn't see it. The day shift never saw what Brooke saw. At 0600, while she was charting in the break room, the room where conversation died the moment she entered, her phone buzzed. Text from the charge nurse, Dr. Caldwell wants you in his office. Now. The walk to his office took 43 seconds. Brooke counted them like she counted heartbeats in a crisis, like she counted rounds in a magazine. Control lived in numbers. Control lived in knowing exactly where she stood in space and time. Caldwell's office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Norfolk Harbor. The kind of view that cost money. His desk was mahogany, his chair Italian leather, his hands manicured. When Brooke entered, he didn't look up from his computer. The power play was deliberate. She recognized it from 14 years of watching men who needed to establish dominance because they'd never actually earned authority. Close the door, he said. She did. It clicked with the softness of a weapon being chambered. I've made a decision regarding your assignment to Admiral Hayes, Caldwell began, finally turning to face her. His expression carried the confidence of someone who'd never met a consequence. Effective immediately, you're being removed from his care. I'm reassigning you to post-op recovery. Brooke's hands remained still. Her breathing remained steady. May I ask the reason, Doctor? The Admiral's family has expressed concerns about your demeanor. They find your manner with him overfamiliar. Unprofessional. The lie moved through the room like smoke. Brooke had interacted with the Admiral's son and daughter twice. Both times, the family had been distant, guarded, the way military families learn to be when classified history hung in the air like a thing that couldn't be named. They hadn't complained. They hadn't expressed concern about anything except their father's arrhythmia and his prognosis. But that was the architecture of what Caldwell was doing, building a paper trail that looked sound from the outside, the way military courts-martial looked sound when the operation being protected was too classified to defend. Doctor, I haven't had any negative interactions with the Admiral's family. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'd welcome the chance to clarify. This isn't up for discussion. Caldwell's voice remained level, which made it more dangerous than if he'd raised it. I have documentation of your behavior. The family's complaint was verbal and sensitive given the Admiral's status. My responsibility is to ensure appropriate clinical boundaries are maintained. Brooke recognized the structure now. She'd lived through something like it before, the way accusations without evidence became fact in the record, the way silence became guilt, the way systems protected themselves by erasing inconvenient truths. I'd like to see the documentation of the complaint. Caldwell smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just been given permission to hurt someone. Your concerns are noted. Security will escort you out at the end of shift. You're suspended pending a formal review of your background. Apparently there are some gaps in your employment history that require clarification. The dog tag against her chest seemed to heat. Brooke felt it like a brand, like a thing that was burning her from the inside out, a reminder that her past was classified in a way that couldn't be explained. Her military record showed a dishonorable discharge as cover. Her service in Marja didn't exist in any official capacity. There were no photographs of her convoy, no names of her unit, no mention of the operation that had ended with an admiral's cold testimony designed to bury something that couldn't be allowed to surface. She stood. Understood. You're dismissed. That evening, at 1847, Brooke was in the post-op recovery unit when she saw Caldwell in the hallway outside the administrative offices, meeting with two men in suits from the hospital's compliance and HR departments. They didn't notice her. She was operating at her baseline invisibility. She was changing a post-op patient's for when she caught fragments of conversation drifting through the open door. Background irregularities. Gaps in employment history. Classified discharge notation. Security concerns. Caldwell was pointing to her personnel file. The folder was thick. He'd been building this for weeks, she realized. Since the moment he'd heard her name, since the moment she'd caught that medication error he'd almost ordered, since she'd demonstrated the kind of clinical competence that made mediocrity visible. He was going to dismantle her using the one thing she couldn't defend, the classified history that was supposed to protect her and instead would bury her? But that wasn't the worst part. At 23:01, when the night shift officially began, Brooke was assigned to post-op recovery, 6 beds, 3 patients, and a view of the cardiac unit's hallway that let her see the telemetry monitors from a distance. She watched Admiral Hayes's room. She watched his rhythm strip update every 10 seconds. The T-wave changes from this morning had progressed. The intervals were becoming irregular. His ST segment was shifting in a pattern that whispered danger the way wind whispered through the ruins of compound walls. She knew what was happening. She'd seen it before. The Admiral's heart was failing, and nobody was watching carefully enough to catch it until it was too late. The charge nurse for the cardiac unit was Taylor, who'd graduated 2 years ago and had excellent instincts but no experience with the kind of deterioration that killed silently. Caldwell had left at midnight. Brooke had watched him leave, keys in hand, entirely absent from the hospital. At 0245, the telemetry monitor at the nurse's station lit up with an alarm. Room 304. Admiral Hayes. Brooke moved before she made the decision to move. Her legs were already carrying her toward the cardiac unit before her brain had finished formulating the consequences. She abandoned post-op recovery. Policies didn't matter. Caldwell's suspension didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that there was a man in a hospital bed whose heart was failing, and the only person with the training to recognize exactly what kind of failure it was happened to be moving toward his room at a speed that would look normal to anyone not paying attention. She reached the doorway and saw Taylor standing frozen, hands shaking, staring at the monitor as the rhythm deteriorated into something that looked like the beginning of ventricular fibrillation. "Step back," Brooke said. Not a request. A command. Her voice had changed. The invisible nurse was gone. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The monitor screamed its warning. And Brooke Sullivan, Major, Navy, classified and buried and marked with a dishonorable discharge that was supposed to keep her erased, walked into that room prepared to do exactly what Caldwell had hired her to do and then tried to kill her for doing. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She moved like someone who'd already survived the worst thing a system could do to a person, and found she was still standing. The monitor flatlined at 0303. One continuous tone. A sound like the world stopping. Brooke was alone in room for 12 when Admiral Raymond Hayes's heart quit, no warning, no gradual descent, just the sudden absence of rhythm that meant death was standing in the doorway. She didn't reach for the call button. Her hands were already moving. Chest compressions. Hand placement perfect. Fingers interlaced. Her weight driving down through the heels of her palms into his sternum, counting cadence the way she'd counted it in a dust outside Marja when a convoy medic took shrapnel and stopped breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4. The compressions had a rhythm, that of a metronome wound too tight. 120 beats per minute. The exact frequency that kept blood flowing to a brain that was 3 seconds away from dying. She called the code over the intercom without breaking rhythm. Code blue, room 412. Cardiac. I need crash team now. The intercom crackled. Crash team moving. 30 seconds. Her compressions never faltered. 60 seconds. The room was beginning to fill, a respiratory therapist, a nurse, a resident whose name she didn't know. They moved around her like she was a stone in a river, like her hands belonged there, directing the current. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. In a tent in Helmand Province, under mortar fire, with a man bleeding out from a compound fracture and no surgeon within 30 kilometers. 2 minutes into the resuscitation, she felt it. The absence. The Admiral's chest wasn't rising with the ventilations. Air wasn't moving into his lungs the way it should. She glanced down and saw what she already knew: his chest on the left side wasn't expanding symmetrically. A tension pneumothorax. The resuscitation itself was forcing air into the pleural space, collapsing his lung, turning his chest into a trap. He's not ventilating, she said. The resident looked up from the defibrillator pads. Tension pneumo. We need a needle decompression. The resident hesitated. That hesitation was the sound of someone whose training lived in textbooks. Brooke had trained in that hesitation too, once, before Marja taught her that thinking was a luxury you couldn't afford when people were dying. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. Not a request. An instruction. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The respiratory therapist had already found the needle. Brooke adjusted the Admiral's position with one hand while keeping compressions going with the other, a movement that required her body to understand 2 separate tempos at once. The needle went in. There was a hiss of air escaping. She could hear it even over the monitor, even over the crash cart rolling in, that small sound of pressure releasing. His left lung expanded. The monitor rhythm shifted. Still flatlined, but the anatomy was fixed now. 3 minutes. The crash team arrived with Dr. Marcus Caldwell behind them, and the room transformed. Larger. Louder. The attending took position at the head of the bed and Brooke expected the natural shift: the attending takes over, the nurses fall back into the support roles they trained for. Instead, she stayed where she was because the Admiral's chest seal was compromised. The commercial occlusive dressing they'd applied was peeling at the edges. Air was leaking again. The lung was collapsing again. They needed a new seal. The trauma supply cart had been empty when the shift started, a supply chain failure from the afternoon shift that nobody bothered to report in writing. Brooke reached for the crash cart, her hands moving on their own, checking what was there and what wasn't. The room had split into 2 realities, the one where Dr. Caldwell was calling out drug doses, and the one where the Admiral was running out of time. In that second reality, Brooke didn't hesitate. She reached for the protein bar in her scrub pocket. She'd bought it 6 hours ago from the vending machine on the 4th floor, eaten half of it at 2 in the morning when there was nothing else to do. The packaging was plastic. Glossy. Waterproof. She ripped it open with her teeth, a motion that sent the respiratory therapist's eyes wide, and used the wrapper to create an occlusive dressing the way she'd done it in a field hospital when the supplies ran out and people were still dying anyway. 3 sides taped. 1 corner left unsealed so air could escape without building pressure. She placed it herself. Her fingers found the exact position. The tape sealed along the ribs. The Admiral's chest expanded again. Epinephrine 1 mg 4, Dr. Caldwell called out. His voice had changed. Not angry yet. Just different. Like he was recalibrating what he was seeing. Brooke kept her hands on the dressing, monitoring the seal. For minutes. The monitor showed something. A flutter. Electrical activity returning. The resident called out the rhythm. Sinus. Weak but there. The Admiral's eyes opened. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the room exploded into controlled motion, lines being checked, medications being verified, the ventilator parameters being adjusted by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The Admiral was breathing. His heart was beating. The rhythm on the monitor looked like something that belonged inside a living person. Brooke stepped back from the bed. That was when she saw Dr. Caldwell's face. His expression had gone white. Not with relief. With something else. Something that looked like rage compressed so tightly it had nowhere to go. He walked out of room 412 without a word. She knew what that meant. She'd seen that look before, in the office of Colonel Williams at Bagram when she'd filed the report about the field surgeon. The look of a man who'd just realized that the invisible person in the room was still breathing. The crash team dispersed. Orders were given for the Admiral's transfer to the cardiac care unit. Brooke was still wearing her gloves. She peeled them off and threw them in the biohazard bin, each motion separate and deliberate, the way you moved when you understood you were being watched from somewhere you couldn't quite see. 18 minutes later, she was sitting in the administrative office on the third floor with a folder in front of her and a suspension notice in her hands. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, wouldn't meet her eyes. Dr. Caldwell has expressed serious concerns about your judgment during the Admiral's resuscitation, Patricia said. The Admiral's family has filed a complaint about your bedside manner. They felt you were overly familiar. Intrusive. Brooke didn't speak. She'd learned in military court that silence was a statement. Your assignment to the Admiral's care is being terminated immediately. You're being reassigned to floor cleaning while HR reviews the incident. I saved his life, Brooke said. The words came out flat. Informational. Like she was reading a blood pressure. Patricia shifted in her chair. You acted without proper authorization. You overstepped the chain of command. Dr. Caldwell was present. He was running the code. If you had concerns about the treatment protocol, you should have flagged them through proper channels, not taken matters into your own hands. His chest seal was failing. That's for the physician to determine, not the nursing staff. Patricia signed something. She slid the paper across the desk. Brooke didn't pick it up. She could read it from where she sat today. Suspension pending investigation. Grounds, insubordination. Unauthorized treatment of a restricted patient. Refusal to follow established chain of command. Possible mental health crisis. Security walked her to her locker. Walked her to her car. A man named Gerald who'd worked security at Oak Creek for 17 years and couldn't look at her either. She drove out of the parking garage and didn't go home. Instead, she found herself back in the same garage, in the deepest level, where the light was thin and the shadows were thick. She parked in a corner space where nobody came and turned off the engine. 3 hours passed. Maybe 4. Time moved differently in the dark of a parking garage at 4 in the morning. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear. From something else. From the particular tremor that came from holding yourself together so tightly that the seams started to split. The dog tag hung against her ribs beneath her scrubs. She'd worn it through the resuscitation. Worn it through the firing. The metal was still warm against her skin. One single tag on a broken chain. The only thing she'd kept from Marja. The only thing that proved it had been real. She held it in her fist and the metal pressed into her palm hard enough to hurt. The orders had been clear. So clear they'd been written on official Navy letterhead, signed by people whose names she wasn't supposed to remember. Disappear. Accept the discharge as cover. Never surface. Never speak. Because officially, Major Brooke Sullivan did not exist. Officially, Operation Tidebreak had never happened. Officially, the entire team, the operators, the medics, the support crew, had been erased from the record like they'd never drawn breath. She'd broken that order the moment she'd called the code. She'd broken it again when she'd saved an admiral who'd testified under oath that she was reckless and unstable and a threat to operational integrity. She'd broken it in front of Dr. Caldwell, who was somebody's brother, who had connections, who knew how to make phone calls that mattered. And now she was sitting in a car in a parking garage in Norfolk, Virginia, with her hand shaking and a suspension notice on the passenger seat, and no idea what came next. The orders said disappear. But she'd just done the opposite. She'd surfaced. She'd let someone see her. She'd let someone know that she was capable of saving a life with nothing but her hands and a protein bar wrapper and the memory of how to do things that were supposed to stay classified forever. The dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through the parking garage, illuminating nothing, changing nothing. She was still sitting there when it arrived. The grey dawn never came. At 0600, there was a knock on her apartment door in the pre-war complex off Military Highway. 3 hard knocks. Military knocks. Brooke didn't move from the kitchen chair where she'd been sitting since 2 a.m., still in her scrubs, still wearing the dog tag. The knock came again. She opened the door to find a man in Marine Corps dress blues. Tall. Early 50s. Eyes the color of stormlight over the Atlantic. Colonel Raymond Hayes. The Admiral's son. His ribbons told a story that matched hers: combat tours, Valor citations, the weight of classified operations sewn into his uniform. Major Sullivan, he said. Not a question. Sir. I'm Admiral Hayes's son. He paused. The hallway smelled like stale coffee and someone's burnt toast from 3 doors down. Thank you for saving my father's life. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Major. He'd said it clearly. He'd said it knowing. Brooke didn't speak. Couldn't. The dog tag felt like it was burning through her chest. The Admiral didn't know who you were at first, the Colonel continued, his voice steady as a laser sight. 14 hours of cardiac monitoring, and he didn't recognize you. But when he woke up after the code, something clicked. He asked the nurses about you. They told him you'd been fired. That's when he made the calls. Brooke's jaw tightened. One measured breath. My father has a lot of clearances. A lot of friends. Within 6 hours, he'd accessed your sealed file. The Colonel's eyes didn't blink. That's when he found out what the Navy did to you. That's when the real nightmare ended. She stepped back. Gestured him inside. The apartment was small, studio with a hot plate, a futon, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The home of someone who'd learned to live invisibly. The Colonel Saturday. She stood. This was how it went, rank maintained through posture, through bearing. Through the kind of silence that only soldiers understood. Hospital administration flagged your classified security clearance during a routine background check, he said. Standard procedure when your name appeared in the Admiral's medical record. That flag went to the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. That triggered a cascade that brought investigators from Naval Criminal Investigative Service to the hospital at 0800 this morning. Brooke's hands moved to the kitchen counter. Steadied herself. The fluorescent light above the sink hummed its mechanical monotone. There's a Navy SEAL team leader named Commander Mitchell. He's in a conference room at Oak Creek Memorial right now, and he's reading your file aloud to the hospital administration. Silver Star for sustained action under hostile fire. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy commendation with Valor that was sealed because of the classified nature of Operation Tidebreak. The Colonel's voice carried the same precision his father's had, the voice of someone accustomed to command. The SEAL commander is crying, Major. Actually crying. Because those medals should have been presented 12 years ago. Brooke closed her eyes. 12 years. The exact length of her exile. There's more, the Colonel said. A 3-star Admiral is arriving at Oak Creek Memorial this afternoon. He's coming to formally name your decorations from Marja. The classified mission where you held a trauma site for 14 hours under enemy fire after my uncle abandoned his post as field surgeon. The mission where you saved 7 Marines while maintaining the perimeter alone. The Admiral who court-martialed you was forced to classify the entire incident to protect the Navy's reputation. To protect my uncle's brother from prosecution. The sink dripped. Once. Twice. The sound of water hitting stainless steel, so ordinary it felt obscene. That admiral has already submitted a letter of apology through the Navy's Corrections Board. The colonel stood. He was 2 inches taller than Brooke, but she felt the air pressure change as he approached. They're opening an investigation into Dr. Caldwell. Into his motivations. Into whether he knew about your service and deliberately escalated his attacks. Brooke opened her eyes. How could he? His brother served at FOB Shank during tide break, the colonel said. He was present during your court-martial. He was present when you were dishonorably discharged. And 6 months ago, he sent your sealed file to Dr. Caldwell in a text message with the caption, "She's a traitor. She disobeyed orders and got her team killed. She's working at Oak Creek. Make her life hell." The colonel's jaw clenched. My uncle is being investigated for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Dr. Caldwell's actions are being reviewed for evidence tampering. She found her voice. How do you know about the text? The FBI is at the hospital, the colonel interrupted. They've been interviewing staff since dawn. They accessed Dr. Caldwell's communications. They're building a case for obstruction of justice and evidence destruction. He moved toward the door. The hospital IT administrator, a Marine Corps veteran named Torres, documented that Dr. Caldwell accessed the security system 3 times in the days after the Admiral's code. He tried to delete the footage of your resuscitation. Torres saved every frame and documented every deletion attempt with timestamps and access logs. He submitted a formal report to federal investigators. The apartment seemed to shrink. The walls pressing closer. The dog tag growing heavier against her sternum with each heartbeat. What happens now? Brooke asked. Now you stay home, the colonel said. Now you don't go anywhere near that hospital. Now you let the legal system do what it should have done 12 years ago. And now you wait for the Admiral. He left without another word. She heard his dress shoes echo down the hallway, the sound of professional boots on cheap linoleum. The sound of the military coming home. At 1400, there was another knock. This time it was 6 naval officers in dress blues and a 3-star admiral whose chest was a constellation of medals. The admiral held her classified file in his hands. He read the citations aloud in her apartment, his voice steady as granite, naming each commendation as if they were prayers. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. The words hung in the air like resurrection. Major Sullivan, the admiral said, I was present at your court-martial. I was present when I ordered your discharge. I was present when I classified Operation Tidebreak to protect an officer who did not deserve protection. He set the file on her kitchen table. I cannot undo what was done to you. I can only acknowledge that you were wronged. Officially. Formally. With the full authority of the United States Navy. She didn't speak. Couldn't. The SEAL team leader beside him was crying. Actually crying, the trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind that comes from holding a truth too long. By day 4, the Washington Post had run the story. Operation Tidebreak. The decorated Navy nurse who was wrongly court-martialed. Oak Creek Memorial Hospital, the institution that fired her after she saved the admiral who'd testified against her. The hospital released a statement immediately. They were suspending Dr. Caldwell pending investigation. They were offering Major Sullivan a formal apology and a position in their nursing administration. They were cooperating fully with federal investigators. Dr. Caldwell's allies on the hospital board distanced themselves. His calls went unreturned. His scheduled surgeries were reassigned. The nurses who'd ignored her in the break room were suddenly being interviewed by federal agents, expressing concerns they'd had all along about his conduct. The Admiral's son released a public statement thanking Major Sullivan and calling for accountability. By week 2, Dr. Caldwell was terminated for evidence tampering and professional misconduct. 6 months later, Brooke stood in the East Room of the White House, wearing her navy dress blues for the first time in 12 years. The uniform felt like a second skin, the one she'd been born to wear. Her ribbons told the story her voice never could. Silver Star. Purple Hearts. Navy Commendation with Valor. The medals hung from her chest like a prophecy that had finally come true. Admiral Raymond Hayes sat in the front row, in full dress uniform, his ribbons matching hers in complexity. When the President announced her name and her service was formally declassified, Admiral Hayes stood and saluted her. Not as a superior officer. As a witness to truth. She returned it. The room erupted. After the ceremony, he approached her in the marble corridor where the light fell in geometric patterns through the tall windows. Up close, his eyes were weathered by years of command decisions and classified burdens. "I testified under oath that you disobeyed orders," Admiral Hayes said. "I knew it was a lie. I've lived with that dishonor for 12 years, Major. I cannot undo what I did, but I can witness who you are." Brooke met his gaze. "You're alive, Admiral. That's enough." 3 weeks later, she returned to Oak Creek Memorial to collect her belongings. She'd accepted a position at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C., a full-time clinical director role overseeing combat casualty care. The Navy was taking her home. She walked through the main entrance in her dress blues, her ribbons catching the afternoon light. The automatic doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, the hospital smelled the same as always, antiseptic and coffee and something underneath like human suffering and hope compressed into fluorescent-lit silence. She passed the cardiology wing. Past the break room where the nurses had avoided her. Past the conference room where Dr. Caldwell had once sat, building his empire on contempt. In the hallway near the security desk, she saw him. Dr. Marcus Caldwell was wearing a night security guard uniform. Navy blue polyester. A name tag that read security. He was emptying a trash can, his hands moving through the motions with the mechanical precision of someone whose agency had been surgically removed. His eyes fixed on the floor as she approached. They stayed fixed on the floor as she passed. She could have said nothing. Should have. But instead she stopped, turned, and spoke clearly enough for the nurses at the station to hear. "Power is not a title," Brooke said. "Power is the ability to help." She walked toward the exit without waiting for a response. Behind her, she heard the nurses go quiet. Heard Caldwell's breathing shift. Heard the simple and absolute truth of a life spent in service outweigh every institutional power he'd ever held. Torres, the IT administrator, the Marine who'd saved the security footage, was at the security desk. He saluted her as she passed. She returned it. The automatic doors opened with their familiar hiss, and the Norfolk afternoon flooded in, warm and salt-edged from the Atlantic. A Navy staff car was waiting at the curb. She touched the dog tag one final time, let it settle against her skin where it belonged, then got in. The driver pulled away from Oak Creek Memorial smoothly, professionally. Through the rear window, she watched the hospital recede, the building that had tried to bury her and had failed, the way all institutions eventually fail when they stand against the truth. Brooke was finally going home. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.